This is the Troutbitten Podcast.
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten?
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten?
Yeah, Troutbitten.
Troutbitten.
It's about trout.
Wild trout.
This is Troutbitten.
This is the Troutbitten Podcast, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Dominic Swintowski. I'm the owner of Troutbitten and the author of Troutbitten.com. All right, this is the second episode of our two-part discussion on angler pressure. Last time we talked about how fishing pressure affects the fish, how they respond to more fishermen placing more casts and more drifts in the waters around them, how trout change, both short-term and long-term. Tonight, we're building on those thoughts and offering some solutions. Because if trout are adapting their habits in response to us, then we must modify our approach to stay one step ahead of the fish. I used that phrase in the last podcast a couple of times too, and it's a good way to think about it. Our fishing is based on fooling a trout. What are they looking to eat? How can we attract them to a fly and then convince them to eat it, right? And while you might have the methods and flies necessary to fool your local trout right now, it might not work just a few years from now, or even a few weeks from now, because trout and the rivers they live in are always changing. So our approach must keep changing too. It's just another aspect of trout fishing that makes it all so wonderfully complicated. It's also why we like to fish for wild trout, but more on that in a minute. First, let me introduce the Troutbitten crew and answer a few questions from listeners. Thanks for sending these in. We got at least a dozen of them here in the first day, really, of this podcast being launched. All right, let's say hello to Josh Darling. Missed you last time, buddy.
Yeah, missed being here.
Josh is the owner of Wilds Media. He does the video work for Troutbitten and much of the graphic design and photography. Josh, I have a question from Jim Lawrence through email, and this applies to you. So figured we'd get it kicked off here. Jim asked, Dom, I've been following Troutbitten for 3 years, and I've recently been watching everything you put out on YouTube. I love the tactics stuff. I really do. But have you thought about telling stories with these videos? It would be cool to see something that could end up on the fly fishing film tour one day. Your work certainly stands out. So that's nice, Jim. Thank you very much. And every time someone compliments the videos, I got to hand it over to Josh. He's the one with the gear, the skills, the knowledge, and everything to put this stuff together. So, Josh, do you want to answer Jim's question?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess when we first started talking about doing videos, we did that video together called The River Doesn't Owe You Anything. And that was sort of, while it wasn't a story, it was more artistic and less tactical. And I think that kind of solidified that this would be a good, partnership to do this. And then we've talked a bunch since then about wanting to eventually break away from the tactics for certain videos and do more artistic storytelling kind of things, or do more article reads, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's always been our hope, and it certainly has been mine. It's always been my intention to submit a piece to the Fly Fishing Film Tour, and
right on.
Whether that's with Troutbitten or Wilds Media or just another collaboration, which is, I assume, would probably be the case. But it's nothing in this round of submissions, but I'll say it's coming.
I think I have to catch a night namer first, right?
Yeah, that's the long-term video we're making.
It's long-term. It's the 10-year build-up to Trevor catching the namer.
Yeah.
Finally snagged one.
You'd be fishing in like 32K by then.
Yeah, there you go.
You'd be filming in 32K by then.
32K footage. Yeah.
Who knows how you'll be fishing, Trevor?
I already fish in 32K. Just a step ahead.
All right. We're going to get over here to Matt Grobe. I have a question from Trey on Instagram for you. This is kind of for everybody, I think. But he says, Dom and crew, love your work. Your angler pressure podcast is much needed. Where I fish in Colorado, trout see multiple anglers every day. You guys mentioned how long it takes for a trout to calm down and eat again. But I was wondering if you would put more concrete numbers on this. I know it's a guess, but will you guess anyway? He asks. And so Trey is right. We mentioned a lot of the variables that complicate this question. And I noticed we were all purposely avoiding, giving much in the way of a real answer, because there's all these variables. So I know others have this question too. So let's do this. That's what I'm thinking. Matt, and then everyone else, if you want to chime in, think about your favorite river. Imagine it at a popular time, let's say, but without an active hatch necessarily. Because we talked about how if they're on a hatch, sometimes they'll ignore that angler pressure. But anyway, under average water conditions, cloudy day, let's say the sun isn't right in their eyes. Let's say these trout see 6 anglers each day, spread out over the day, daylight hours. And so they're used to pressure, but not so much that they've just accepted, anglers as a constant part of their environment either. So how long, and let's 3 questions here. Here's what I'm thinking. How long for a 12-inch wild brown trout to reset and be willing to feed again if an angler simply walks by close enough that the fish spooks but doesn't swim away? What's the time in minutes or hours? We know we're rounding it off, but this is what Trey and others really kind of want to hear. I think it's fair. Give them a gauge. What do you think, Matt?
Wild brown trout, I'm going to go
just walks by.
Nymphing.
Just walks by.
Nymphing.
Mhm.
I'm going to go 45 minutes. Dry
Mhm.
fly eating.
Mm.
I'm going to go an hour.
All right. Anybody else? The angler just walks by. Doesn't walk right through the fish.
I think Creek, I've seen 10, 15 minutes sometimes in like
Yeah.
a blue-winged olive hatch, and that's for surface feeding. But I think that's the caveat there is that it's a highly pressured stream. The fish see a lot of pressure, and it's during a hatch where opportunity
Right.
is short. So I think all those things change that timeline from what you're saying.
So no hatch, though. Think no hatch.
Yeah,
That's what I'm saying.
I'd be with Grobe.
Under 1 hour.
There you go. I like that. That's Austin right there. Josh, you got anything? Smarty?
Yeah, I mean,
Pretty boy?
I don't know if you're gonna bleep out what Trevor said about the creek name
On that river?
Yeah, perhaps on rivers that do see more anglers. If we're talking like they see 6, and that's the number we're going with. If they see 6 anglers on a river that they see, if they're used to that, then that's I'm expanding on it. That's not necessary. You gave us all the
It's hard.
You gave us all the bounds to work within. I think it can be less though. I really do. I
do too.
I really do. I've certainly seen times where it's 15 minutes and it's good to go again.
I know.
So,
That's my thing. I was going to say
yeah.
20 minutes. Again, the angler just walks by or walks beside, right? And I'm saying you could be in the water, but you didn't blow up the fish. You didn't walk right through them. You have more to say there, Matt.
No. I mean, you're right. We can go down. I think we could go down the rabbit hole again because I've seen one of my favorite rivers has a bunch of rafters in the summer, and I've seen the fish spook when a family of 5 rafts comes blaring down, commercially guided, and then I'm into fish in 10 minutes, right?
I know.
So
right?
And the other thing is the species. I firmly believe that wild brown trout, a 12-inch wild brown trout's spookier than a rainbow trout. A wild rainbow trout. For whatever reason, browns are wary. They have a reputation for a reason. And so Trey's talking Colorado. There's a lot of, he's fishing tailwaters in Colorado with these big rainbows. You can stare at them and they don't move.
There you go.
And so,
Yeah.
and they don't. I mean, and
There's
so
more variables.
there's a lot more variables. So I think it's a complex question. I think we acknowledge that, right? I think if we're just shooting by the hip, it's never a good thing, right?
No. So people want simple answers.
Yeah.
And, it's fishing. Like we kept saying last week, there are too many variables. But let's do this. How long will it take for that same wild brown trout to reset if you stand there and fish for him? And Austin kind of brought this up before. He says he thinks that, if you're lining the fish, if your line touches them, of course, if your fly touches them, but if he just sees flies even drifting by, if he kind of senses that you're there and he sees some good drifts, he sees some bad drifts, but never really eats the fly or maybe even feels the line either, how long does it take for that trout to reset? We'll throw numbers out there again. Same fish.
I'm gonna go. I'll go first again, but I'm gonna say 4 hours on most fish. Right? There's always going to be the exception, and I think just if you follow someone that can fish, we've all tried to follow somebody.
Right.
I mean,
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Well, you're never doing as good. Like
right.
If they're
Run and
catching
clean up.
fish,
Yep.
right? Like it's one thing if they're not. So that's how I always gauge it. I'm like, man, it's like, oh, I'm struggling today. And I see Dom around the corner and he's grinning ear to ear. It's like, well,
right.
my fish didn't reset.
Yeah. That's why I like to front end Austin when I'm fishing with him. I just constantly like, oh, he jumped in front of me. Oh, I'm sorry, Austin. I got to get up there.
I know it helps your ego, so I don't say anything.
I don't want to fish his scraps.
I think the size of fish makes a bit of a difference too.
Here we are,
There you
another
go.
variable.
I think
Pounders.
the bigger.
12 inches. That's 12
I like
inches.
that you
already
picked
told
12 because over 12, I think as they
Pounder.
get, yeah, I think if you get into the 16 and over fish, I think they're going to take longer to reset.
There you go. Agreed. I don't think anybody's disagreeing with that. We're all nodding. I said 20 on that first answer because we just waited beside him. My minutes, I guess, would be 60 minutes and 1 hour for that trout that we just fished to fully reset. There's another variable. Yeah, he kind of resets. He's kind of ready to eat.
I'll say 2 hours on that one.
All right, on. Certainly can't disagree with any of this. Josh Batum, darling.
Yeah. So you're saying the trout knows that it's being fished for.
Well, pretty much.
It knows that
He's
you're
been
there.
disturbed.
But okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Been disturbed a bit by drifts. He sees good drifts, bad drifts.
Yeah.
And yeah, probably it's especially when you walk past him. Now he knows you're there. Or
Yeah.
that you were there.
So both things have happened. He's seen the line or the flies or many flies, and then he's seen you walk past. Yeah. Over an hour. I don't know.
Right on.
Yeah.
So we're helping Trey out, maybe helping some other people out, helping me out because I like the perspective. You guys generally think it takes longer than I do. Last question, though. The last thing we can do is really displace that trout. How long until that same trout resets if he is, let's say, he's hooked and released? We fool him. He's hooked and released, or maybe even snag him accidentally. He's hooked and released in less than a minute, right? Quick process. And how long until he's stationed again and feeding? Everybody's very uncomfortable.
I'm going to keep going about I'm going to go back to the nymph thing and the dry fly thing because I think it could be two different things because the trout exposes itself more eating dry flies subsurface. I think if you foul hook them nymphing, I think they could reset possibly in 15, 20 minutes.
No kidding. Shorter than the other one.
Yeah. Just because it isn't eaten. Wow. We talking foul hook. I'm down to the foul hook. Okay. So,
because he didn't make a mistake.
Right. It's just like, I foul hooked the tail of a fish. I've seen fish go back into feeding lies and just and not get spooked. I'm not talking. I don't have fish scales on my hook. I'm just like I'm pulling up, and you ever see them like move a little bit because you hit them with a green weenie.
Sure.
And then
so you didn't land them, but
like I've seen green weenie's a good example. I've seen fish. I've had fish and set the hook and hit them right on the first drift, and then I can see the fly and then the fish eat. So I'm going to go 20, 25 minutes when the green weenie's hot.
Kidding. Very cool.
And then dry fly fishing, I think it's just longer. I think once they taste that floating and shit, and you set the hook and you miss them, and I think they're more susceptible to.
I think they've taken a bigger risk too at that point, and so they've put themselves out there more. And then they got rejected.
They're embarrassed.
Exactly.
Got to go hide from their friends for a little bit.
Right.
That's right.
Yep.
Get turned down.
That's right.
I'm going to stick with 2 hours.
You still want 2 hours?
Sure.
I've heard people say it'll take them days to reset after something like that.
After being caught?
Yeah.
I feel like not in our scenario that we're discussing.
Agreed.
Maybe in a different stream.
Yeah, but you hear about that stuff in like New Zealand. I don't even know if I believe it. Do you believe that? Like,
no, I don't at all.
What are you referring to?
I haven't seen that trout in 3 days.
I don't care how mature, wise. I don't care the situation. I don't believe it.
I'd like to think it's true.
I mean, it's kind of cool.
I don't think a trout is going to shut down for that long. They can't afford to shut down.
Tell people what you're talking about.
They can't afford to shut down. Yeah,
it's just like you hear stories of these like streams in New Zealand where you walk 3 miles for this one brown trout, and if you screw up the opportunity, that's it. Like you're not gonna see that fish for 3 days. And I'm like, man, why is anyone fishing in New Zealand then? Like, if that's the truth, like, oh my gosh, right? Like, why would I fly all the way there? I can get those fish in the States. I'm talking smack on New Zealand. No, I've never been there, so I don't know what I'm talking about as far as New Zealand goes. But I read this stuff, and I can't not start wondering. Like, wow,
I know
that's kind of cool if you're trying to stock this 2-foot brown in New Zealand. I guess I don't know. I'll shut up.
No, I mean, I've been told too. I've had a lot of clients. I say a lot. I bet I've had 15 or 20 clients that have been to New Zealand. And they tell me about it. And about half of them tell me it's not that much different. And maybe it's where they were fishing and they're like, oh, they're not that spooky. And I'm like, well, people tell you. Yeah, but the ones we fished it wasn't like that. That's what they say to me. And so I bet it's just like around here. I mean, you're going to find some really spooky situations and maybe the waters are really low. And, again, more variables.
Maybe they're really smart marketing, Dom, because it's like,
that's what it is.
If they market that and you blow the fish up, it's like, well, I knew what I was doing before I flew out here. Yeah. They're really spooky.
This kind of lines up with the study that we were talking about last week with the remote and the more remote stream in New Zealand was prone to far longer periods of time before the fish would reset. And I think if you're talking about top end size of fish and then you're combining it with a rural stream, I don't think you could even assume that it may take 3 days to see that fish back in the same location, but it doesn't mean he's not eating. He may just be eating in a more protected and covered lie.
Absolutely. For over a decade, Smith Creek has provided innovative, high-quality fly fishing accessories designed to put your gear in easy reach, free up your hands, and keep our waters clean. For 2023, check out the all-new patented tippet holder. Each unit is individually machined from billet aluminum and anodized in 2 eye-catching colors. They hold up to 5 tippet spools with a spring-loaded plunger that is quick and easy to use, keeping your tippet spools right where you need them. Also, the brand new Rod Clip Plus comes with an improved 304 steel pin, plus a carabiner clip, giving you 2 ways to attach it. All Smith Creek products are built guide tough and backed by solid customer service. To learn more about Smith Creek products, visit their website at smithcreek.co. Tactical Fly Fisher was founded by Fly Fishing Team USA angler Devin Olson to bring anglers cutting-edge gear and techniques from the international competitive fly fishing scene. Tactical Fly Fisher's aim is to help you improve your angling ability so you can have more fun on the water. Whether you need some flies, fly tying equipment, or a new rod or reel, they've got you covered. Head on over to tacticalflyfisher.com and use the code TBPOD10, that's TBPOD10, to get 10% off flies, fly tying supplies, or terminal tackle.
So let me ask you guys this. Last spring, maybe 2 springs ago, my friend Ryan and I were floating one of our more popular rivers, let's say. And we were in a pretty heavy sulfur hatch. And we were anchored up and we were watching a legitimate 20-inch wild brown continually rising and eating off the surface. And he was fishing for it. And the fish came up, ate his fly, hooked it. He had it on for maybe 2 or 3 seconds and it came off. Thought, oh man, that fish is gone. A couple hours, come back maybe. And Ryan instead said, sometimes when they're rising this heavily, that fish will come back up in a matter of minutes. And I was like, no way, man, that thing's done. Sure enough, maybe 2 minutes later, it was rising again. Through that dry fly, it came up, ate again, and then we caught it. And I couldn't believe it. Have you guys experienced that sort of mindless behavior or response in a heavy emergence?
Stocky.
I've actually experienced it not on an emergence. I've actually experienced in the opposite, like really remote stream, doesn't see any traffic, and it was a squirmy wormy. And I hooked it 3 times. I hooked the fish 3 times. And you know who was with me? Paul Weimer watched it. He said he never saw anything like that before. So I think
it's
there's
rare.
something.
I think it's rare.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's the norm, but I think when you have a fish, it's certain, like coming out of deep winter or the sulfur hatch when they look forward to every year or whatever, they're trying to gorge. Maybe they lose, just like a big buck loses his awareness during the rut. Maybe these fish lose that awareness, right? A little bit when they're feeding and they lose it, right?
Yeah.
On one of our slightly larger rivers, I've had that happen where just on a nymph where I've actually hooked the fish briefly. It's only like a half second, maybe a second that it's actually on, and then it's off again. And then maybe 3-4 minutes later, hook him again in the same spot and land him. And so it's certainly happened. I just think I think that is an outlier. It's rare that that happens.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It was just odd that he called the shot and it happened almost immediately afterwards.
That's good though. That's cool that he had the confidence and gave it a try again.
Yeah, because I would have just pulled up anchor and on to the next one.
Or you could just very easily half-heartedly throw it in there with not a good drift. Matt?
What if it was another 20-inch fish, Austin, that just moved into that fish's feeding line? I always think about that. Right? You think
brothers, sisters.
Who's saying there wasn't when you have the sulfur hatch especially, sometimes there's so many heads popping, you can't even you can't even see, how many fish are rising. And I always think, well, if you spook one, does one move into that prime lie, right? Like quick? Who knows?
Well, I'm not going to call you a liar, Austin. I believe you.
I called you.
It was the same fish.
Rise a liar.
I'm not saying I'm not. I believe you, Austin.
No, I'm saying I could tell you.
Glad I brought that up.
I could tell you maybe 3 stories where the same thing happened on a trico hatch, and I could see the fish. Often with the trico, you're fishing low, skinny water on the edges where they're finally sipping the spinners. And I never really had to fish on for a long time, but just for a couple seconds, boom, 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 and then he's off. And 2-3 minutes later, I hooked the fish again.
There you go.
And,
now Trey's really confused.
Yeah, now Trey's really confused.
Trey, we have no answer.
That's like a mind-boggling thing at night, is that you really can get into a fish, really pull on it hard, and then have that same fish take it 8 seconds later.
Yeah,
I mean,
we've talked about that a bit.
Yeah.
I think
in the summer.
Sorry,
please.
I think they're going for the type of prey that gives feedback, and they're not. If you're going and eating a large crayfish, and you get bit in the mouth by that crayfish, you're not like, oh, I'm not going to eat again.
Interesting,
right? Like you're kind of expecting it. Or if a bird falls in the water and you're eating a bird and you get a talon in your throat, I just think you're going into that experience with a different expectation.
I think
eating food that gives feedback.
I think, long story short, Trey, I think the Troutbitten crew would be kind of cool if you go to that water you fish a lot and take notes, because you can spook fish or get behind someone that's through a hole and get in there and see how long it takes for your stream to reset, right? Because maybe it's different, maybe the circumstances are different. Be interesting to hear back from him if he does that, right. and curious to see what his results are.
Right on. I think it's valuable to kind of go through that little exercise right there with what we think anyway, and then we start talking through all the variables. Yeah, that's the way it goes. And I just think it's a very common question. I was already getting that a couple times today, sure. And if I was listening to that podcast last week, I'd be thinking the same thing. Yeah. Well, wait a second. How long? What do you sure. think? Okay, give me a ballpark. And I've had so many clients ask me the same question. All right, Trevor, we heard your voice. We know what you sound like, right?
Yep, you do.
Anything else we missed last week that you wanted to bring up regarding trout behaviors and the studies that you read?
No, I don't think so. I think to summarize a lot of what we talked about, there's a lot of variables, and remote and heavily fished streams are different. The species of trout is different. Yeah, and as we just talked about, what's spooking them is probably another factor there.
Hey, Austin, we know what your voice sounds like, right?
Yep.
There you are. You want to say anything special?
I went out Saturday morning, sunrise, and dodged the angler pressure. I had about 5-6 hours of solitude, and I got back to the car, drove out, and every access was packed with people just going in.
So you dodged the angler pressure by fishing a different time.
Yep.
Early.
Yep.
Yeah.
You're on the dawn patrol.
I got back to the car, and the guy was like, "You just wrapping up?" I was like, "Yep, I'm headed back home for Easter lunch." He's like, "Oh, how was it?" I was like, "It was pretty good, but it died off now."
It died off. That's what you do. Good job.
The chubs are biting.
Yeah.
Yep.
I was telling him the truth.
Yeah. Nothing more predictable in fishing than going out early.
Yep.
And we could say that over and over, and it's not going to make a difference. The average angler is not going to get out there early.
Get there
not
first.
Not that early.
Nope.
Unless I'm there, then don't get there first.
Don't get there first on my river.
So, all right, what Austin just talked about there is a good way to kind of bring us into our topic. We want to talk about tonight, how does angler pressure affect the fishing? And really the fishing, meaning the decisions we make as we fish. And really here, where we fish, when we fish. Not just how we fish, but really water selection, I think, is a really big deal. There are a few angles on this to cover. And the first thing I want to mention is how the presence of more fishermen affects the waters we choose to fish. Or again, here, where Austin chose an earlier time to fish. And I think you guys know what I mean, right? Water selection.
Yeah, I think that's great, Dom. I think there's so much into this, but I think there's also, the daily angling pressure, right? Which potentially leads us into the whole dawn patrol, early morning thing. And then there's the seasonality of pressure that mounts, throughout when most people fish. And I do think those two things will have different impacts at different times. A lot of anglers, maybe the fish are more, I don't want to say it, they're more conducive to dealing with the pressure early season, where maybe at June they're not. They're like, I mean, I've had it. I'm so sick of getting blown off this bank, and I don't know. I always find that I feel like the harder fishing out here is towards the end of the season. Like I feel like
I agree.
It's a combination of low water and pressure and and all that stuff. So it's a thing that we'll dive into here, but it's complex too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that I oftentimes think about certain stretches of water more during the winter and even early spring than I do during mid-season, where I may not even think about going to because of the easy access or the number of cars you're going to see parked there. But it may be that truly is prime water, but I'm just not willing to fish alongside other people.
Right. I mean, I don't know any angler who leaves the house and says, boy, I hope I get to see a dozen anglers today where I want to fish. I mean, there are social anglers out there, and we've all met that guy who wants to pass you up and say, hey, let's have a conversation, Sure. And I try to avoid that conversation. But I do that by avoiding where people are going to be. Like you said, Trevor, there are places where I am not going to fish in May and June. I just won't. But I fish them the most in January and February, and I enjoy those places. So instead of thinking about where's the prime water, it's all good. If there's wild trout in there, it's good water. And I just use those heavily pressured times to go and fish those places.
Yeah. Yeah. I use another weird, like I was out today and I fished local, and I utilized like the conditions that we have out here right now, which is a lot of snow on the banks. It's not easy to get around. And it caused me to choose a relatively popular place, but I knew that slog to get to the river was enough that it's going to eliminate 98% of the anglers. And so, but if you drove down, and it's weird out here with melt right now, like some south facing areas have no snow, but the north facing stuff and in the trees has a lot of snow. But if you drove around, the places that you could park and get to the water without having to slug through, well, they were loaded. It was 72, the first 72 degree day here since September, and there's people that have cabin fever and they're all over the place. Mm-hmm. But you do some, a little contemplating, like, I'm going to go where people don't like to go. I want to go where it's hard. And I think that's it, right? It's like the easy stuff is going to be the most pressured stuff. I think it's an easy thing to assume, right?
We did a full podcast on this. I think it was season 2. We talked about like why everybody fishes the same water and how to avoid it. And that's the obvious thing. What Matt said, it's kind of a game with me to kind of predict where people are going to fish and then do the opposite and just have confidence in your tactics. And again, it's especially if it's Class A wild trout water or something like that. The trout are in there. It doesn't have to be specially regulated water. And I don't know, even if you don't think there are as many fish, accept that challenge. Get away from the rest of everybody else. Get away from those heavily pressured trout. And that's a great way to deal with angler pressure. Get the hell away from it.
Right. Yeah, especially if you're after catching fish. I mean, we just said it. Yeah. Like you're going to be fishing behind people, right? Mm-hmm. The chances are it's not going to fish as good as it would if it was fresh water. Yeah. And so I think you need to understand that going into it, that angling pressure, whether it's spooking fish, hooking fish, there's multiple things in there that if somebody, not just one angler affects a hole or the two holes that you're looking at fishing. Yeah. Or it's, 4:00 on a day where you've seen the parking lots packed, boy, maybe it's time to fish that brookie stream if you want to catch fish or whatnot, I don't know. I mean, that's.
Unless it's a hatch situation, if you're not there first, like for me, I just don't go. If I'm not the first one there in a crowded, busy time of year, I'm just going to choose to do something else. I'm going to fish that brook trout stream.
Now, Austin, I've always been like that, right? But I will say in the last few years, especially since I've started guiding, do you ever just go where you know there has been a lot of angler pressure? Not necessarily fish right through the angler pressure, but I don't know, go in the evening when you know that most people are out in the afternoon, for example, and just fish heavily pressured water. I don't know, for that specific challenge to see if you can figure out what heavily pressured trout need you to do.
Yeah, and that usually ends up because I'm there for a hatch and maybe I'm there early and I nymph up through an area first, or I'm working on an emergence and then just end up in that situation.
Yeah.
But I don't go out seeking for it. It's usually just something I kind of fall into.
Gotcha.
Another trick is you can park like a jerk. We ran into that this past week. Dom and I were filming on a river.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you know what? I think I want to fish this stretch when we're done. And I knew we wouldn't be done until 10 o'clock or so. And Dom, you said, if you want to fish this stretch, you might want to move your car, take up more of the parking spot, maybe
park in the middle.
Yeah. Persuade people to go
you
elsewhere.
Fit 4 cars in there, but not the way Josh parked.
Filled the
was
whole
only
thing
room
up
for one.
and nobody showed up.
Dom has a Suburban with a camper.
Yep. Yeah, I got the whole stretch. Didn't see another soul out there.
Dom has a hot dog truck.
Hot dog truck. That's right. Just take a trailer along.
Dom's hot dogs. The whole 2-car parking lot's shot. No one's fishing there for the day.
I like that a lot. Bring some orange cones.
Oh, you bring some orange cones.
This area under construction.
You should.
Posted signs.
We need to
Just
build
quickly
that.
put some real bright orange posted signs up.
Dom's bait
Fishing
shop.
closed to the public.
That's right.
That's dirty.
Oh, man. But, back to I do, Dom. I fish pressured water purposely. In the evening, I said purposely. It's just, look, if that's the time I have to fish I float one of the most famous rivers in the lower 48 later, when, might 100, 200 boats isn't abnormal for a stretch
in
to
a
see.
day.
Oh yeah, easily. And I found that the fish, after a while, those fish settle down, and they just had 200 people chucking flies at them, and we do fairly well. I'm not going to sit here and say we have banner days, but enough to warrant more floats. Like, I can't wait for that again. And when you launch at 3 or 4 o'clock at night, we don't see anybody. And sure, there was a lot of fish hooked that day, but you get the right bug. To Austin was saying, man, those hatches can do wonders to certain rivers and fish and sections.
Yeah,
Last one on. I agree with that.
Yeah,
that's nice too. First one or last
Just
one?
don't fall in the middle.
Yeah, I
That's a
agree
good
with
point.
that. I don't like the middle, the bumper boats, everybody's out, and and it's kind of, I don't know. I feel like we're coming across as being pretty negative Nelly on the mid afternoon, and it comes, and we are, and we're after fish numbers, and I think there's also something to be had about, let's face it. There's it's busy, but you can still walk. Usually, you can walk even on these famous streams, whether it's in Pennsylvania or Montana, and find a side channel or the bee water within a famous stretch, right? Because there's always bee water within a famous stretch. Maybe the hard to wade stuff, and I think we've talked about that, but maybe just look at the most challenging stuff to wade or fish. People don't like getting beat up. I always look for the white water, man. Give me some white water. And
hardest stuff to stand up in.
Yeah, and I did it today. I mean, again, I was like, the bank that was easy to fish, you saw footprints. It was tough. I got out into the middle of the river. Water's 35 degrees. Tight line the far bank. Bam, bam. Do those fish relocate from a pressure standpoint? I always believe that, right? Like, I firmly believe I was the only guy that was getting good casts. And there was footprints everywhere, And
well, yeah.
I say footprints in close to the bridge. Like, I got away from everybody today, but right where the access is easy, even with the snow at bridges, I was picking fish off, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And just thinking about it differently.
That's what we're saying. There's ways around it. There are ways to deal with it. And I said last week how I have been such a skeptic of angler pressure through the years because I almost I don't want that out. I don't want myself to say, wow, there's so much. Hey, I can't do any better than this because it's just, heavily pressured. And there's my excuse. And then I stop working as hard because I'm like, well, there wouldn't be anything that I could do. I can blame it on the fish. Well, blame it on the angler pressure. I don't want to do that. And that's why I will go out, even maybe in the middle of the day, maybe not shoulder to shoulder, but, right in the heart. I've done it. I have 2 hours to fish. And like you said, Matt, I'm not going to be hiking up into a canyon or something like that. So I'll have 2 hours to fish. I'll park, where everybody else is, and I'll find my spots. And I know I'm the 8th, 9th, 10th angler through there, but I'll see if I can get it done. And sometimes you do well, sometimes you don't. But there you go. I mean, that's fishing. If I don't do well, I probably shouldn't blame it on the other anglers that much, because you have those maybe surprises where you go, dang, I just did really well in 2 hours. Sure. And I was fishing behind 3 or 4 other guys.
Well, and you might learn something, right?
Absolutely. You definitely are going to learn something. And either way, you're going to learn something. But again, it'll come down to all those other variables, especially water conditions. I thought what you guys pointed out last week, that water conditions, if it's a little bit dirty, it opens everything up for so many more anglers. Imagine if someone put as much time, thought, and effort into designing fishing apparel as you put into finding fish. Well, someone did. Squala Fly Fishing builds waders, jackets, shirts, and pants so well designed, dependable, and comfortable, you hardly notice them. When you're wearing Squala, you're never hot or wet or unreasonably cold, so you can focus on more important things, like fishing. They don't make gear for everybody. They make gear for us, the like-minded few, serious anglers who don't take themselves too seriously. Check them out at squalafishing.com. Then use the code Troutbitten10, that's the number 10, for 10% off your first order from Squala. As fly anglers and tires, we understand the value of having the right tool for the job. AvidMax.com offers over 20,000 products and the knowledge to help you find the right tool for your job, whether that be at the tying bench or on the water. Listeners of the Troutbitten podcast receive a special one-time discount code at AvidMax.com. Enter the code TB10 at checkout on full-priced items to save 10% off your order. Orders over $25 ship for free, so you can put more gas in your tank or beer in your cooler. For all things fly fishing and tying, elevate your game with AvidMax.
Do you think the fish will move out of water that maybe you guys, I think you guys covered this to an extent last week, but do you think the fish will move out of water that is pressured for, day to day, again and again and again, that water is pressured every day? Because, you see, like we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, how a fish reacts if it's just seen a fisherman. We're talking about getting out before the fisherman, but what about stretches of water that see fishermen again and again and again? Do you guys just skip over that water? Because, generally that's what I would do. I would just skip over that water generally. Even if I'm the first one there that day, I'm going to skip the water that I know got hammered yesterday and the day before and the day before. And that's why I think most of us, when we park our car, we don't get right into the water. I think that in most cases we walk, let's say, a half mile, Yeah,
I think everybody's experiences are different a little bit with that, because I think it just comes down to I think the big mature 22 plus inch fish may be more prone to that pressure than the pounders and stuff. There's always, I always say there's always a reason some of these holes are famous, right? Like they're pretty good. Yeah. they always have fish, and I think our central PA streams in general are good examples of that, right? There's really good holes right along the road that get pounded every day, and they have tons of fish in them.
Still got fish. That's right.
I see it out here. I do think at some point big mature fish react to that. And I'm not talking, 18, 20 inch fish is a really big fish. I'm just talking like really big fish. And they might not, maybe they hunker down deep in those holes, Josh, and come out at night. Maybe, you know what I mean? But
yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think they would vacate more for thermal issues than a lot of pressure constantly. But that's just my opinion.
And like we said last week, they have to have somewhere to go. If the headwaters get way, way too thin, or I don't know, whatever your conditions are down below. They have to have somewhere to go.
Sure. Well, I was going to say, so maybe you don't think that a stretch of water, just because of angler pressure, will over time lose the fish that it has in it.
It doesn't seem to. Think about the most popular area on our most popular stream where you can park. And,
Yeah, sure.
I mean, there's fish there all the time. I fish there just from the bank quite a bit. When I have an hour and a half, I catch fish almost every time. And I know people who've literally fished there every day. Every day.
And
They're
do
like
well,
retired, and it's their thing. They have lunch or donuts in the morning and whatever. They fish there every day. And the fish are there every day.
But is there a fish over 12 inches?
And there may not be as many of them. There are a few, Trevor.
Yeah.
If you talk to those guys who fish it every day, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I get one of those fish that are 16 or better every 2 weeks or something like that."
Yeah.
I bet the biggest fish in the river isn't there, Trevor. Right?
Yeah.
I think we're in agreement on that.
Because I think that's what a bit of that evidence seems to suggest, is that there is a behavioral difference in the smaller fish and more of a tolerance. Because their metabolism too is different, right? Like they have to eat more frequently and they're eating smaller prey, and so they're kind of forced into that.
I think it's just my tendency. Like it's just my tendency to skip that water now, and it's partially because I'm fighting for time. Yeah. Like if I'm gonna have a few hours out, I'm gonna make the most of it by going to water that I don't think other people have touched.
Right. Remove that variable in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's angler pressure. You want the pure experience as close as you can. Get it?
Yeah. What were you gonna say, Matt?
I was just, I think seasonal. You might be able to find, nicer fish in some of those sections more than low water conditions and whatnot, right? Like I think fish move in and out of the system, right? And just because there's a certain time of year that area gets pressured doesn't mean that same area, that sees a little bit less pressure in the winter, or there's a lot of high water going on. Those big fish might be in and out of there, right? Because to Dom's point, where are they going to go? But then when the water gets low, maybe, I don't know. There's a lot back to the variable stuff. I mean, there's just a lot of different variables here to dissect.
So I've already received a few messages suggesting that angler pressure isn't that big of a deal, and that the trout don't change much, or that it's crazy to think that they are shying away from particular flies in just one generation or two. Now, again, not only have we seen this firsthand, and we believe that, but yes, there are studies that Trevor brought up last week that document these changes in just one generation. I acknowledge that. That sounds crazy to me too, but I've seen it, and there are studies that back it up. But here's the thing. If you're fishing for stocked trout only, then all of this will probably be a lot different. Right, guys? I mean, stocked trout versus wild trout.
Yeah.
This is a big deal.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a big deal. When you're dealing with any of the wild fish in our waterways, you're typically dealing with which generation of wild fish that is. And they've continually been bred to select for the warier, the less risk-taking, likely less aggressive feeders, more likely to seek shelter. And so that compared to a hatchery fish, which might be under lighting 24/7, grow tolerant to it, and then be taught to aggressively feed without a lot of discretion. You're dealing with two different animals entirely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like imagine like a lion born in a zoo. Like it's going to react very differently to seeing a human than a lion in the wild is going to react. Like,
there you go.
Yeah,
that's nice.
Trout are similar. I mean,
yeah, totally.
They're born. Obviously, we know that they're bred to grow fast and eat aggressively and all of that, and it shows when they get into the wild.
To me, stock trout can be some of the most unpredictable trout.
Sure.
Growing up in the southeastern portion of PA, unless you were there soon after opening day, the trout behavior would change every single day. And I think the same thing goes on in central PA. They get freshly stocked, and then they have that kind of silly behavior to them. And then they start changing. They start to see anglers. And I think they adapt to seeing those brightly colored flies. And they remember, I got caught by that fly. I'm not going to eat this squirmy wormy anymore. Just like a wild trout might. But I think their rate of change is sometimes more dramatic than a wild trout's diet.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
Because everything is so new and so different all of a sudden.
I grew up in Western PA, and it was almost all for stocked trout. And I found that frustration that you're talking about there, Austin. They would relocate. They would be in completely different water, even Saturday to Sunday. It would seem like there was nothing there. They would take one thing. Well, that's trout fishing, but they would take one thing one day and they would not even touch it the next day. I'd say, though, those hatchery trout, arguably, the state is stuck in the same genetics, the same genetics this year as they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. I would assume that there's some variation, but my point is that those hatchery trout haven't grown any wiser. They're from the same brood stock, so to speak.
Right. Every year you're starting that developmental clock over again.
Thank you. And that's my point. And so we acknowledge that the wild brown trout, wild rainbow trout, even wild brook trout, they get to adapt to their environment. And if there is angler pressure, like we're talking about, they can be more and more selective about pattern and presentation.
Yeah. Sure. That's kind of what I was alluding to, and that like a 12-inch wild fish may be in its, fourth, fifth year, and yet a 12-inch stocked fish from an experience standpoint may be in its first year. And so there's just a really big difference between those two.
Yeah.
My dad is going down to fish down in Maryland on a stream where we used to fish every year. It doesn't count. That's right. I'm not going to say the name, but we used to say this river doesn't count because you could catch 100 fish there some days. If you still have to work really hard. I think I told the story about my buddy Steve trying to get to 100 each. If you can wade hard enough and stay out there, basically, from dawn till dark, you could catch 100 trout, stock trout, and they were all like cookie cutter rainbows. I mean it. They're all like 11 inches. And so Dad's gone back there to fish. I can't go with him. But anyway, neither one of us have been down there for 6 or 7, 8 years. We were adding it up. And I guess my point is that those trout, I'm like, Dad, here you go. And I gave him he was here for Easter, and I gave him a bunch of pink flies, some squirmies, some mops, and a bunch of, let's say, junk flies. And then a couple of other things too, but pretty bright, gaudy flies. And I feel 99% sure that those trout, because they're stocked, are going to eat the same things that they were eating 6, 8, 10, 12 years ago. You know what I mean? They're fresh.
Hands down.
Mm-hmm. And power bait's not changed in how many years?
That's right. It doesn't need to either.
Don't
Josh,
you know it?
familiar with
Yeah. I dip all my flies in stink bait before I fish them.
Dom,
he needs every advantage.
For sure.
Sorry.
One other thing to consider, and maybe some of these, and I'm not defending any of these or the comments or whatnot, but some of these places have an asinine amount of fish per mile, right? And so like our streams, Central PA streams, are really healthy, right? And I think they're, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 2,000 is it at 2?
Oh, I'm bad at that.
Yeah,
but plus I
our
don't think
local
per mile
Spring Creek's
matters,
got like 4,000 fish a mile.
Right, but some of these places, some of these tailwaters that folks fish, I mean, they have 15,000 fish per mile. And
but the rivers
think
are
about
bigger.
the width though.
Per
they
river
are,
acre is what matters.
But maybe they feel
acre.
their experience, right, is like, oh man, every time I go down through here, I'm whacking fish. It's like, well, there's 15,000 fish per mile.
Right.
We're talking about, that's an abnormal stream.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. There's not a ton of those out there.
Mm-hmm.
So people might have false expectations too. And it can go into the stock trout or, I don't know too many wild trout places that have 15,000 per mile. Like I know the San Juan has a ton, but they stock that with fingerlings, right? And maybe the Green River in Utah, I don't know enough about it.
I think that's stocked too.
It could be. And they have a ton of fish per mile, right? And so if you're fishing over that many trout per mile, I'm sure you can throw a orange worm on all day, every day, and again, man, these guys are full of shit.
That's like the river Dad's about to go fish this weekend. I always said, like, those fish are hungry. They put them in, they just overstock a very infertile stream.
Insane amount of fish.
Yeah.
They get.
It is. Yeah.
They put
so
7,000 or 9,000 fish in that section.
Yeah.
Like 4 times.
I know. So they're competitive. with each other. They're very hungry, and they're just all over your flies. They really are.
It's fun. It's
fun for
fishing.
a while. I know,
yeah, it is
right?
fun. I
It's
used
fun
to do
for a
it. I mean,
while.
I lived 35, 40 minutes from that stream, and boy,
It's fun.
I didn't have any problems doing that.
The top 10% of wild brown trout streams in Pennsylvania have an average of 382 legal trout per stream mile and 194 that are 9 inches or longer. Whereas one of your more prominent streams, Grove, in your region, has about 10 to 15,000 per mile.
Yeah,
That
that's
doesn't
not-
sound right.
No,
it
doesn't.
I have a real problem with the per mile thing. It's got to
Yeah.
be per river acre.
For density.
Yeah, I mean, if the river is
Well, I think they do
20
that,
feet
too.
wide, that's absolutely completely different than a river that's 200
Sure.
feet wide.
Yeah,
Sure.
that's a big difference.
But I mean, I think in the thou, like regardless, like the blue ribbon,
Yeah.
1,000 fish per mile, depending on the size of the stream, to Dom's point, because if you spread out, there's some rivers out here that have 1,000 fish per mile, and that's nothing. Like you look at the
Yeah.
size of these rivers,
Right.
man.
Exactly.
woo,
You're like, oh,
that's
not
tough
bad.
fishing. Like,
I
but
know.
if you have a medium-sized creek, 1,000 fish per mile is a lot of fish, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. And so, but I get the top 10%, but Trevor, I mean, I can see the top 10%. I think what you guys are experiencing most days is in the top 1% of the best of the
Yeah.
best. So
Yeah,
I
right,
think
we got
that's
a
a
lot of
lot
trout.
higher than the 100 or
Yeah.
whatnot.
For sure.
And then even out here, 10 to 15,000 fish per mile. I mean, there's some of the tailwaters, I think, on good years get that, but I would say anything between like 1,000 and 5,000 fish, depending on the size.
Yeah.
Fish per mile is a pretty darn good. You're getting people from out of state to fish that.
Right.
Wild fish per mile.
Yeah, right.
Man, what an elitist. Wild fish. Got to be wild
Yeah,
fish.
man. We're gonna
You
go
hear
to
that guy?
Pounder Heaven where it doesn't count, and I'm gonna crush
Can
him
I-
on a pink worm.
So, guys, we've mentioned this a little bit last week. Let's talk about this. I've mentioned this on the website before. I call it convinced or curious. What are we trying to do with our flies? Are we trying to convince the fish that it's something natural that we're presenting, or are we trying to make them curious and go, hey, what the heck is that? It's that natural versus attractive debate. So how do you get a trout to eat your fly? And you can do this with the presentation. Like I could take a nymph and do some really unnatural things with it. Think about that. I could take a very natural stonefly imitation, a really good looking natural imitation, not a bunch of flash, not a bunch of extra colors, not too many wiggly legs. And I could do very, let's say, unnatural, but maybe attractive things with it and make that trout go, hey, what the heck is that? I got to test it. Of course, the only way they can test it is put it in their mouth and see if it's real. Or I can try to get the most natural drift possible with that really natural stonefly or whatever pattern. Convinced or curious, natural versus attractive presentations. I mean, I think that's what we're all out there doing day to day. I kind of try to have it in my mind what I'm trying to do. Am I really trying to convince them that, hey, here's a natural pattern, something you see every day. This is safe. Please eat it. Or please, pretty please. Or am I trying to kind of, I'm not going to say startle them because we're not trying to throw them off, but am I trying to attract them, right? Am I trying to attract them with something that they're curious about, but not throw them off too much? I'm always thinking, which one am I really trying to do? And anyway, how does angler pressure affect that concept?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, go ahead, Grub.
You don't have to know, Trevor.
I'll
Matt does.
jump in. I think I do because I think at the beginning, like if you look at a calendar of all the hatches and stuff, and when I'm trying to fish in the spring, I think the early onset of the hatch, I'm able to get away with more and not necessarily worry about pattern. And sure, we're always concerned about the drift, but as the hatch progresses and the fish have seen more patterns, let's say it's day 14 into the hatch, then I may be more, it's harder to catch the fish, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Right. And so then I'm
more selective.
They're more selective. I'm looking at maybe throwing a different dubbing or going more natural and not a bead. And then just as I'm doing that, there's we'll go blueing olive, then the granum, then sulfurs. Like then there's just that new thing out there, and the fish haven't seen much, and so it kind of goes. How much time am I spending on the water, and when, am I at the early stages of the size 14 or 12 sulfurs when they're just crushing them, or am I at the back end of the size 18 and 20 sulfurs when I feel like it's more challenging?
My buddy Rich, who I've brought up before, he was very much of the belief that you should show trout the newest thing that they are seeing. So if there were 3 different hatches going on, what's the most recent?
That's pretty cool.
Size 16 sulfur, so he'd go for that. That was his first guess.
Sure.
But his buddy Josh, who was from Colorado, he was the opposite. He's like, no, whatever they've seen the longest. And these guys were 30 years older than me. And I remember sitting around the fire, listening to that. I was very early on in my fishing experience, and I trusted these guys. But I thought it was so interesting. They had very different, polar opposite concepts of what you should do there.
Sure. That's all pretty freaking cool stuff.
It is.
When you think about it.
Whether it's after a fishing trip or at a backyard fire, you can bet the Troutbitten crew has a case of New Trail Broken Heels along with us. It's honestly our favorite beer. This hazy IPA is smooth and full-bodied. Hand-selected Citra hops lead to notes of bright clementine and juicy ruby red grapefruit. Broken Heels is a keeper. New Trail beer is proudly brewed in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and delivered cold to your favorite craft beer retailer every week. At New Trail, it's not about being the best angler. It's about getting out there. So enjoy nature's moments and reward yourself for a day well fished with New Trail Broken Heels. It's Troutbitten's favorite beer.
I tend to think that trout's ability to choose a fly out of curiosity is sort of a luxury. I think I look at, to borrow a psychological principle, do you guys remember Maslow and his hierarchy of needs?
Ooh,
so
now.
Second from the bottom in the hierarchy of needs is safety and security. So one of the most essential things for survival is safety and security. And the very top of that pyramid is self-actualization. So I think a curious trout is a self-actualized trout. And I think he doesn't have the luxury of being curious. He does not have the luxury of being curious.
Let's get him on.
And
Get him on the podcast.
let's get Maslow over here.
No, the trout.
The trout.
The self-actualized trout.
You know who he is. You know who he is. But I just don't, I tend to think that a trout that feels very safe and secure is far more likely to be willing to take a pattern out of curiosity. And this was mirrored in the New Zealand study we talked about last week, where the fish that had been caught began to very quickly gravitate towards natural and smaller patterns.
Yeah. Matt doesn't buy all that New Zealand crap.
That New Zealand stuff's shitty, man. I don't want to fish there.
At some point, too, a trout that's too curious is going to make too many mistakes and be dead.
Right.
Sure.
Even if it's not somebody's flies, but just, putting itself into harm's way too often.
Yeah.
Well, how often when we're thinking about the convincing drifts and the patterns and we're focused on a particular hatch, if you really, especially in central PA, there's one hatch after another, right? So if you really think, we all know that most trout feed under the surface, right? So just because you see all these sulfurs on the, they're sailboats, right? And you just assume, oh man, I should be fishing for those sporadically rising trout with a size 18 sulfur. But oh, by the way, you know, I'm making this up. Well, I'm trying to really what comes after sulfurs? I
don't know. There's some caddis in there, let's say.
That's a great one, caddis.
Right.
Did you ever try just nymphing who's really fishing a Waltz worm tight line, during that? And what if you have crazy success, right?
Yeah.
With that, because the fish have changed. And I've experienced that and I'm not going to give out the pattern because it's the Troutbitten special Western version, but in the salmon fly hatch, right? Everybody's throwing a big bug, and why wouldn't you, right? I'm going to throw a big size 4 dry fly too, but what I'm going to suspend off that has nothing to do with stone flies. And oftentimes I'm smoking fish. And But Buddy's like, "Wow, cut that off." I'm like, I don't want to cut that off. Like, you know why? Because I know those fish have gone. The adults are on the banks. They're not seeing the nymphs anymore.
Right on.
And so they've transitioned into, they're looking for other bugs that are about to hatch, right? And so I guess where I'm going with this is with the drifts, right? If you're trying to mimic the dry fly at the tail end of a hatch, you could consider just changing the pattern altogether for the next phase of insects that's about to emerge on your streams.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that.
Right on. Almost stay ahead of the game.
Yeah, so I think, a takeaway for our listeners, I think, may be that if you're fishing water that gets pressured more often or more highly pressured fish, consider starting with more natural patterns, things with maybe less attractor type aspects to them, and vice versa. If you're fishing very lowly pressured water where you want to really have an attractive pattern, pull fish in from farther away, that theory could fall through at any point in time and any given river. But
yeah, we know that.
But if you have to have a place to start, I think that we all see maybe some trend.
Right, and smaller too. More, I think more natural can, just lends itself to being smaller.
Yeah, in general, for sure.
Even if you have something flashy on that number 20, boy, there's not as much flash on it as if it's a number 14.
Right.
And above all else, if you don't have good drifts, they're not going to eat it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get hung up on patterns so much. It's fun to think about the convinced versus curious, or the, I don't know, it's probably to a fault that I don't search patterns as hard as I should, but I don't know. It's a hard question.
Sure.
Well, I'm saying convinced versus curious within the presentation as well. I'll sometimes start to hop my nymph if they won't, even just a pheasant tail. That's not natural. The way I'm hopping it is not natural. I'll do streamer things or crossover streamer things with my nymph. And I'm trying to make the trout curious, just trying to elicit some kind of strike, just trying to get them hot somehow.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's it. I think the pattern is one thing, but we have to do different things with our presentation sometimes too. But like Austin is saying, get good drifts. That's the baseline of success. My gosh, more than 90% of the time. We agree with that.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
And fly fishing is so often about a dead drift on the top, dead drift on a dry fly. That's your baseline. Guys will say, "Oh, you can skitter your dry fly." Well, okay, cool. You better know how to dead drift it first. That needs to be your baseline. That's all. And then you can skitter it and hop it and neat things like that. And the same thing with the nymph. And people drastically underestimate what it takes to get a true dead drift in one seam, going down naturally, down in that strike zone usually.
Agree.
That's your baseline. And if you can do that over and over, and it doesn't work, then okay, deviate. We'll change pattern. Okay, that's easy. How about changing the tactic?
Yeah.
Maybe you do start to lift it a little bit and drop it, lift and drop.
I think that's
Those are ways to make them curious. Trevor?
I think that's probably where some people make false assumptions about patterns, is they have a poor drift at baseline, and certain patterns are more conducive to looking natural under that drift, whether it's more of a bait fish imitation or something that might have some natural movement to it, and they might assume it's more pattern related, which it may be. I guess in some sense it is, but it's far more tied to the effectiveness of their drift.
I think that's why everybody will tell you fish a woolly bugger. Like if you're that's the recommendation to a lot of new anglers, fish a woolly bugger. Right. I think a fly like a woolly bugger is very forgiving, and trout will eat it obviously on a dead drift, but they'll be a little more forgiving, meaning they will eat it if it's swinging or it has some tension on it and lifts in the water. They'll go, oh, that's a small minnow or a leech or whatever it looks like.
That's why our friend Bill Dell fishes streamers.
Well, yeah, because he doesn't have much talent.
He surely can't do a dead drift.
No, I'm not sure Deli knows what a dead drift is.
Not with 2X.
We talked about it the other day. He's like, what?
Nope. Still over there, scissor kicking on the bank.
Scissor kick.
Yeah, he puts on his Grinch and high holes everybody. Of course he's going to catch fish.
Or like he'll double up on junk flies. And he doesn't care. He just...
No reverence.
He's not even trying to get better. No. All the bad stuff. He probably litters on the bank.
Yeah. He'll pee upstream.
Deli. He pees upstream. Is that what you said?
He's the guy serving Dom's hot dogs at Dom's trailer.
Dom's hot dog stand. I like that. That's not bad. Because not only can you take up a couple extra parking spots, you can have people like waiting at a hot dog stand that's still closed, but it'll open any minute. Just put a sign out that says opening in 10 minutes.
Be right back.
Be right back. There you go. Be right back. That'll draw anglers away from the river. That's how you deal with angler pressure. I'm sure Deli's going to have something to say. I don't know what we're talking about next week, but Deli's going to have a couple things about how to deal with angler pressure. You guys have anything else, though?
No, I mean, I think we covered it pretty well. I mean, I think we gave everybody good pointers on what to do and on the stream. And then we've said it a bunch, but there's so much you can do before you get to the stream to help prep yourself to deal with the angling pressure and current conditions and current hatches. And there's no surprise, right? When any one of us drives to a particular stream at a particular time of year, we probably know what to expect.
Yeah.
Right?
Been around
just
a
from
while.
being out there. So it shouldn't be shocking,
No.
that the pressure's there at the particular time of year. Unless some of us know, we're on the forefront of all the secret streams that nobody knows about,
All the secret ones. The ones that aren't even on Google Maps.
The underground ones.
Underground. That's right. They go underground. We fish in caves.
Mm-hmm. We fish them underground. Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
All I would do is reiterate that if you really want to have water to yourself, you can have it. Go up into the headwaters.
Right on.
And if you're not catching fish, don't blame it on angler pressure too much. There are 100 reasons why the fish aren't eating your fly. Never take that easy out and just say, nothing else I can do.
Sure.
Good call.
Don't be Bill Dell.
We good? Everybody good?
Let's do it.
All right. Hey, Matt, will you read us out?
Remember, the Troutbitten Project is a free resource for all anglers. The Troutbitten website hosts over 900 articles with endless stories, commentaries, tactics, tips, and more. Find what you like through the top menu and through the search page. Navigate by way of the categories and tags too. Be sure to find the Troutbitten YouTube channel, currently featuring the Troutbitten Tip Series, in collaboration with Wilds Media. These are short, useful, and unique tips for your fly fishing life. Thank you for listening to the Troutbitten Podcast. Please give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and leave a comment, because that really helps. Until next time, friends, fish hard, enjoy the day, and find your life on the water.
Hey, now.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh my gosh, right?
Yeah, I could see that.
Stocky.
Yeah.
But
That's good, though.
You're going into that experience with a different expectation.
God. Wow. Ooh, hey now.
Man, what an elitist.
Wild fish. Got to be wild fish. I guess. I don't know. I'll shut up.